All right, in this lesson, we are going to be messing with translations of sine and cosine. This is going to be part one of two different parts. So we're going to do two different examples on this one, and then we'll do two different examples, a little more challenging on the next part. So far, we have messed with the amplitude and the period. So we have not done any kind of what's called a phase shift, and we have not messed with our midline at all yet. So, anything on the outside of your equation is going to have some sort of a vertical effect to it. Anything on the inside is going to have a horizontal effect to it. And your A represents the amplitude. B is going to affect the period. It's not the period, it's going to affect the period. So it's going to be 2 pi divided by whatever your B is. And then your phase shift is going to be a left and right shift. And your midline is going to be an up and down shift. All right, so just a kind of quick refresher. Here's what your sine graph's going to look like. Here's what your cosine's graph's going to look like. We're going to mess with the periods and the phase shifts and all sorts of little things. So here are all of the pieces to this. And I personally, my kind of order that I do this in is I take care of all the vertical pieces of it first. So for my vertical, I take care of my midline first, and then my amplitude second, and then I'll do any kind of a horizontal effect, which is my period, how far out we're talking about, and then last thing I'll take care of is the phase shift. So personally, this is how I go about doing it. There's lots of different ways to doing this, but this is just me. So we'll start off with amplitude. The amplitude on this thing is going to equal 1 because there's a 1 in front of that. And then midline would be any kind of adding and subtracting that I have going on here. There is no midline. We'll just kind of go through the A, B's, and C's. So your period, the phase shift, and the midline. So our midline is nothing. We have no plus or minus, so no vertical shift going on whatsoever. Our amplitude is 1. Our period would be any kind of a number here. We're going to take that number and divide it into 2 pi. So nothing changes on that. And then our phase shift is this. So our phase shift here is a left pi over 2. So a negative pi over 2, or you describe it as a left pi over 2. All right, so let's graph one full cycle. So my midline would be, it's not changing. So right now it's still the x-axis, but that's the first thing that I would do. Is if I had a change in that, I would kind of draw a new midline and everything's kind of focused around that. But I don't. So this is it. And then my amplitude is, we're going to go up 1 and down 1. All right. And then period is going to be next. So I'm going to put 4 marks here. And whatever our period is, that is, from here to here is 1 full cycle. So 2 pi is my period. I'll cut it in half, and then I'll cut it in half. So pi over 2, 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. Okay, so I would be ready to graph. I'd be ready to start with my sine, which would have started on the midline. Then I go up, down, and then be done. However, I have this phase shift. So that distance right there, every single coordinate is going to move back exactly pi over 2. So my starting point that should have been here, because that's what a sine graph looks like, it starts off on the line, is it's going to shift back exactly whatever that distance is. So negative pi over 2. So now I'm going to draw my graph. So a couple ways to do this is you could kind of just lightly put all the points that you would have graphed and then just shift them back. So if you would have started here, it's going to shift back. If that would have been your first point, it's going to shift back. That's going to shift back. that's going to shift back, and that's going to shift back. Or just shift your first point and then just know we're going to go up, we're going to go down, we're going to go back up. So that is one full cycle. And that is our first example of sine being shifted back pi over 2. All right, so we're going to do another one. Gets a little bit more challenging. So this time we're going to be graphing cosine, and cosine is going to start at a high point and then kind of come back up to the top, except it gets reflected. So you have a vertical reflection going on, and then you have this 3 that we actually need to factor it off. So we got to take it out of this parenthesis right here. So we got a little bit of manipulation to do, and then we'll come back and kind of talk through our pieces. So first thing is -2 cosine. We're going to divide off the 3. So if we divide a 3 out of that, that makes it just an x. And then if we take pi and divide it by a 3 because we factored it off, we have that. Okay, so a couple things. You have a vertical reflection happening, so cosine graph should have started at a high point. It's actually going to start at a low point. Our amplitude is being messed with, period's being messed with, and we have a phase shift. The only thing we don't have is a midline. So let's go through. Your amplitude is 2, not a -2, because just a 2 because it's going to fluctuate from the midline up to and down to. That negative is going to reflect it, so it's not considered an amplitude. And then your period is going to be 2 pi divided by your b value, which is 3. So there's your period. And then we'll abbreviate phase shift is we are going to go left pi over 3. So a negative pi over 3, or left pi over 3. And your midline. Again, nothing is happening with the midline. Okay, so for our graph, we're going to go, our midline didn't change, so we're all focused around this. We're going to go up 2, and we're going to go down 2. So we're going to range between a -2 and a +2. I didn't prep for this very well because we are shifting back pi over 3. So let me do a little bit more in the center. So we're going to go down 2, up 2, and then I'm going to put my 4 normal spots here because we've taken care of the vertical aspect of this. There's no midline shift, and we're going up 2 and down 2 for our amplitude. I'll put my 4 equal parts here. My period is 2 pi over 3. When I cut it in half, that'll be pi over 3. And then I cut it in half, that'll be pi over 6. So that's 1/6, 2/6, 3/6 is actually pi over 2. And then 4/6 simplifies down to 2 pi over 3. All right, so that distance is actually what my midline shift is. So I'm going to shift everything to the left 2 spots. So I need 1 and 2. So that's why I kind of need that extra space off to this side. So negative pi over 3, negative pi over 6. All right, so if I'm going to graph this, again, I could just plot my main points, which is going to be reflected. So it's going to start here, then go up, and then back down. But that point is going to shift back. And then from here, I can just basically start my cosine graph. So I'm going to start here, and then I go to a midline. I go to a high point, I go back to a midline, and I go back to a low point. So my cosine graph, let's make that point a little bigger, would look roughly like that. And then we hit low points, so we come back up. All right, so that was a graph that has an amplitude of 2. Our period was all the way out to 2 pi over 3. Except the whole thing got shifted back here, so that's still a distance of 2 pi over 3. And then we had our phase shift, which is what bumped us back. So period's still the same, we just got bumped back. and we got vertically reflected because of the -2. All right, so that was part 1, and then we'll do 2 others that are a little bit more challenging.